Good Mayed. So we spoke previously about the various different zonim, so to speak, the different lines of Esrogim, and the simanim that the Paiskim, establish, to judge the kashrus of an esrog, and how to know when an esrog comes from a blended tree versus a pure esrog, and etc. And we said that we'd revisit some of the more practical examples of how this plays out in halacha. So I thought today I'd revisit the sugya of the Moroccan esrog. Now, what's interesting is as follows: Morocco had till the 1950s, after the formation of the State of Israel, when all the Arab countries in the Middle East purged themselves of their Jews and made their countries almost Judenrein, had the largest, I believe, single population of Sephardic Jewry in the world. Morocco, I believe, had 500,000 or 600,000 Jews living there. I could be off with these numbers, but as I looked during Cup, it had a tremendous Jewish community at Tzibur. It also has a tremendous amount of long-standingness to it. The Kehila in Morocco, the Jewish Kehila in Morocco, in all its different forms, some of the mountain Jews who lived in the Atlas Mountains, some of the desert Jews, the city dwellers, from Marrakesh and etc. There was many, many different Kehilas of Jews that lived throughout Morocco, and they've been there for a very, very long time. The Rambam, Kaidua, during his travels, spent some time in Morocco. The Rif, who was known as Yitzchak El-Fassi, El-Fassi means from the city of Fez. Although the Rif ended up migrating all the way to Spain and became the Gadladar of the Spanish, of the Iberian Peninsula, and from there he became like the Amud HaTavach, the bottom plank for all the Sephardic Jewry. He was of Moroccan origin, l'chaira, and many, many more Gedolim, and the Vada, everybody knows of the famous various different lines of Mekubalim who hail from Morocco, whether it's the Abu Chatzeras or the Pintos, the different dynasties of Mekubalim and miracle workers who hail from Morocco. So Morocco had a very long-standing and ancient from Kehila, and possibly because of that is why Moroccan Esrogim have a certain provenance and a certain benefit in the way of assuming that they don't come from, they're not Morkav, and that they're pure Esrogim in that regard. And I'll explain why that is. Because all the other places that produced Esrogim, this is not fully true, but to some degree, the other areas that produced Esrogim did not have as many Jews living and using those Esrogim. Now, although northern Italy had a large and prominent Jewish community, it certainly did for hundreds and hundreds of years, it was by the numbers a smallish community relative to other Jewish communities, meaning the main Jewish communities living in Prussia and Austria and Germany and Poland and Litva, etc. They by far dwarfed the Italian communities in size and scope. And therefore, all those communities, the hundreds of thousands, possibly millions of Jews who lived in Eastern Europe, who were importing their Esrogim and others of their Daled Minim from Italy, the Esrogim had to come a long way. It was very, very hard to have direct oversight, and at the end of the day, you were relying on various, many, many different hands that the product would pass through before it made its way to the kehillah that was actually going to use it. And because of that, being able to properly ascertain and prove that your Esrogim come from an unadulterated esrog tree that hasn't been tampered with and that isn't a morkiv was very hard to do. And to that end, we quoted the Ramaz in his famous tshuva, two tshuvas, with the Ramaz corresponding with his cousin Rabbi Yehuda Padua, the son of the Maram Padua, who lives in Padua, northern Italy, and asking him to explain to the Ramah, to teach him what exactly qualifies an esrog to be an esrog, and what are the hallmarks, the demarcators that would prove it that it doesn't come from a morkav tree. And in his response, Rabbi Yehuda writes that although it's obviously too far for you to make the trip from Poland to northern Italy to ascertain this on your own, so I'll give you some simanim that you could go by. And we pointed out that the Ramah himself in that tshuva, and Yehuda of Padua in the tshuva, clearly says that although I'm giving you these simanim, and we'll just chaz over quickly what those are, it's the bumpy texture, it's the very thick rind, and it's the way the ukitz is first subsumed inside the fruit and only then grows out of it. Those were the basic simanim that he gives. The Mari Padua and the Ramah both remind us that although those simanim are given, they're not simanim that are set in stone forever for all varieties of esrog. They're simanim that are native to the Esrogim that grow in northern Italy. And like most botanists would say, all of the fruit's characteristics and textures, and even its similarity to other fruits, to other local fruit, has to do with the soil, the alchemy, the bees, the pollens, the prevalent pollens, whatever it is, that allow one fruit to nash off another fruit's characteristics. So you can't really take from there anything that's long-standing forever and ever. Although the Paiskim, in to various degrees, adopt this Ramah and Marie Padua as like the basic premise of what constitutes an esrog. Now, obviously, and we'll go into this in some detail, the Moroccan esrog does not exactly look like the esrog that we're familiar, a Yanav esrog, or an esrog that grows in Calabria, Italy. So now, when did they come on the market? Meaning, of course, for thousands of years, people used them probably in Morocco. They were the local esrog. But when did the Moroccan esrog arrive on the market to become a Eden? So now, it seems that following the Napoleonic Wars in the early 1800s, so the esrog changed, and the esrog trade, and we spoke about this, radically changed. Meaning the ability to import esrogim from Italy to the European continent, to Eastern Europe, became much more limited. And therefore, they started bringing in esrogim from other locations. And we spoke about them bringing in esrogim from the island of Corfu and the area of Praga in Greece, and the various different esrogim. And we've spoken about this in the past, but the esrogim from Corfu were beautiful, and originally they became very, very sought after. Over time, through various cycles of controversy, some kashrus related, some price related, some anti-Semitism related, some Zionism related, various different cycles of controversy that erupted over the esrogim from Corfu, they left the market, and other esrogim began making inroads. Now, one of the esrogim that started making inroads into the market when the esrogim from Corfu began to diminish and then weren't so prevalent anymore was the Moroccan esrog. Now, what's interesting is that we find the Aruch LaNer in his Tosefes Bikurim in the back of Masech Sukkah, in the end of Siman Tafresh Mem Ches, he writes like a glowing approbation, a glowing haskama to the use of Moroccan esrogim. But as we'll see, that wasn't a given. So I want to read what the Aruch LaNer writes. The Aruch LaNer writes as follows. He says, B'shana hazos, kibalti esrog min Morocco. I got an esrog from Morocco. Yafe u'mohuder, a beautiful and mohuderdik esrog, b'chol mine hechsher, with all of the types of hechsherim that you could be looking for. Asher adayin l'reisi kamayu. Now, just judging on its sheer beauty, the priyei tzadar shabai, the beauty of the esrog, the Aruch LaNer says, I haven't seen such a beautiful, fruit before. Oid risi lahasker, he says, shala aniyas daiti, according to my humble opinion, Esrogim she'en gidulam shaven lamuchzakim bekashrus. The esrogim, who the gidul, the shape of the esrog, does not look exactly like the esrogim that we're used to, meaning the esrogim that we always imported through Genoa, that we're always used to, the Yanav esrogim. Milvad chashash morkev yesh gam ken chashash acherim hemi min aksherim. You have to be chashish that they're kosher now. Shezeh vaday shemasha anu leikchem esrog leil hadrashish she'mevi megamara b'sukkah. He says it's clear to know. You have to understand. This that we take, the esrog that we take, is not based on the drashas of the Gemara and Sukkah and the Flamereh and Ralph. Shetam eitzei peri of shava, that the fruit and the peri tastes the same. V'shadar b'ilan mishana l'shana, and that it has a long harvest cycle on the tree. V'shadayim l'dir, v'shagadol al kol mayim, and it needs a lot of irrigation. Bilvad banu semchum l'farish priyei tzadar kain. That's not what we're being semechan to establish that this is a priyei tzadar. Shesimanim eila, those simanim nimtu oid gam b'shar peris. There's many dozens, possibly hundreds of different various fruit. In not just in the citrus family, but in many fruit families that exhibit these exact same characteristic that the Gemara is attributing to esrogim. He says, the ikar is shehalacha l'moshe misinai, k'mo shekasa Rambam in Hilchos Lulav. There's a halacha l'moshe misinai, like the Rambam in Hilchos Lulav in Perek Zayin halacha dalad, right? U'lechein k'sheinim daimim lamuchzakim ad heina b'kashrus einam b'chala kabbalah. When an esrog doesn't look the same as the esrogim that are established until now, it's not included in that Kabbalah, in that Masoretic chain, in that halacha l'moshe misinai that establishes that this is the esrog. And there are many other things that are similarly, that are tali in Mesiris. Oifis that are contingent on the local tradition to eat them. And other locales, asurim, they're asur. So too, says the Aruch LaNer, is how I think you should judge an esrog. So now the what do you call it? The Aruch LaNer himself is opening up, so to speak, Pandora's box. He's saying esrogim, and we said this over from the Chassam Sofer last week. Esrogim are very meseira tali. They're very contingent upon the tradition of how they appear to the eye. the Chazon Ish famously, various different times, would say about an esrog, it looks like a morkiv, or it looks like an esrog. Meaning there's a Messiah, there's a Tzvias Ayin that the Poskim have that establishes an esrog. Now the Rachel felt that although he takes with one hand and says that Esrogim is so Messiah the contingent that it has to look a particular way, and he had to have been aware of the fact that Moroccan Esrogim that he said were beautiful did not look exactly like the Esrogim that Klal Yisrael had been using, from the northern Italy. Afal Pikin, he feels that the Moroccan esrog looks enough like an esrog. It's beautiful. He likes it. He's excited about it. Now, at the similar time, the Rav of London, Rabbi Dr. Nathan Adler, who was the Rav of London at the time in the 1800s, he, when approached for a hechsher Moroccan esrogim that had made it to the market in London, he withheld. He says he did some research. He reached out to the Sephardi Chachamim who had some contacts in Turkey and other areas where they were already been using the Moroccan esrogim for longer. And although they were made to him that in those kehilas, this Moroccan esrog is something that's been on the market for a while and it has a long-standing tradition of kashrus in the Sephardi kehila, he withheld from giving a hechsher. Not only that, he published a short letter where Rabbi Dr. Nathan Adler, publishes and he says we should withhold from using these esrogim. I don't even know that these are a fruit, he says, which is a very interesting thing to say. He says, Mi yemer b'chlal, that these are a peri. It's a cryptic little psak where he withholds and strongly dissuades his tzibur from using these esrogim that were new on the market, but very cryptic, and it's hard to know exactly what he's referring to. Now, there's a sefer called Alpayim Shnais Hadar about the Moroccan esrog. It's a very partisan sefer, but a very useful sefer on this topic. That tries to prove the long-standing tradition, the Messiah, the Poskim that agreed with it. In it, he does a little bit of research to figure out what exactly was bothering Rav Nosson Adler, and he finds that not Rav Nosson Adler, who came from Hamburg, I believe, was a Yakisha Rav. His uncle, who was his Rebbe and who preceded him as the Rav of London at the time, whose name escapes me at the moment, writes about the esrog something interesting, and this is probably what Rav Nosson Adler was referring to. He is the first one to raise this issue, and it's an issue that later on becomes a very, very big issue in the kashrus of the Moroccan esrog. He raises the issue as follows. There's a unique anomaly in the Moroccan esrog that other esrogim don't have. Many Moroccan esrogim, not every single one, but many Moroccan esrogim don't have any pits. They have no seeds, b'chlal. Now, if you've ever cut open an esrog after Sukkot, and I think most people have, you'll notice that there are pits, there are seeds in the esrog, and most fruit have seeds inside of them. Now, what exactly the angle of the seeds are they vertical, are they horizontal, how they lay in the pockets of the fruit, is itself something that the Magen Avraham brings from the Eila Shabbos as maybe a siman as to what an esrog is or what an esrog isn't. But what's unique about the Moroccan esrogim is they don't seem to have seeds at all, which is why, incidentally, Rav Nosson Adler in his letter over there doesn't say, I'm chayshish that this is not an esrog. He says, I'm chayshish this is not even a fruit. Mechatei says this is a fruit b'chlal. Meaning, I don't even understand how this has the characteristics of a fruit. It doesn't have seeds. Now, you want to tell me seeds are not an integral component of an esrog? Okay, fine. Maybe you could say that. But seeds are an integral component of a fruit. And an esrog is certainly a fruit. It's a pre-eitz hadar. How are you going to tell me that something that doesn't even display the characteristics, the calling card of fruit, b'chlal, is considered a fruit? Mechatesa. And this is what Rav Nosson Adler is relying on. To which others, Rabbi Yaakov Safir, the famous Shadar from Yerushalayim, the traveler, but also who was of Litvish origin, writes in his letter to Rav Nosson Adler, do you mean to tell me that you wouldn't make a Bayer Priya Eitz in this? Of course you know it grows on a tree and you'll make a Bayer Priya Eitz in it. So what he's saying, it's not a fruit. Of course it's a fruit. And he and other Sephardi Shaposkim retort that of course the Moroccan esrog is a fruit, and even if it doesn't have seeds, it's technical in nature. Maybe the fruit are harvested too soon, maybe the seeds are a soft type of seed that blend with the pulp, maybe there's like it's a translucent, soft type of seed, and they give different answers to explain why the Moroccan esrog, although it doesn't have seeds, is considered a fruit. Now, this opened up like a can of worms that will haunt the kashrus of the Moroccan esrog, till this day. Now, ultimately, the Chazon Ish, for example, when he examined the Moroccan esrog and cut it open after Yom Tov, the Chazon Ish was I think famed to have said, "Tzat ala de simanim von hamorkiv," meaning it looks like a perfect esrog hamorkiv, which is the opposite of an approbation. So the Chazon Ish was against the this esrog, and many others, the Shevet HaLevi and other poskim, were against this esrog because of this reason. They felt that it doesn't have seeds and it's lacking some of the core characteristics of an esrog. Additionally, it's not nearly as bumpy as the general, the esrog that Jews were used to for generations. I'm talking about Jews who didn't live in Morocco were used to for generations, and because of that, various different poskim, Berosham, the Chazon Ish, but I saw there was a contrast I saw this year that had many others. The Sky Rebbe, the Shevet Alevi, Rav Sarai the Blitzky, other Dayanim and Poskim and Rabbanim. There's many different ones who were unhappy about the Esrogim, the Moroccan Esrogim. Now, who were the Poskim that were very pro the Moroccan Esrogim? So the Brisker Rav, it seemed, loved Moroccan Esrogim. There's a whole arichastic story. I won't say it over in all its glory because it will take 20 minutes. But the Brisker Rav, when he was on vacation in Schweiz in the summer in Switzerland, he met a group of Bachrim from the yeshiva in Aix-les-Bains, the yeshiva in France, I believe. And upon schmoozing with them, they told him they're from Morocco. And the Brisker Rav asked them, would it be possible for you to source for me some Moroccan Esrogim? They said, sure, it would be our biggest privilege. We would love to, provide Esrogim for the Brisker Rav. So he took out his checkbook or his wallet. He said, okay, I want to pay you. What does it cost? He said, no, we would never take money from the Rav. We want to give you an Esrog. Brisker Rav said, but I want to pay for it. It's an Esrog. So they came to a pshara. The Brisker Rav thought of this idea. He said, why don't you send me 2 Esrogim? One you'll give me as a gift, and one I'll pay for. And that was the upmach they made. So the first year or two that they were sending an Esrogim, they found a messenger who was going, from Morocco to France, and then from France to Israel, and they were able to send it to Brisker Rav. But after that, these brachim, I guess, were not learning the yeshiva anymore. They were not able to do that. So they started sending it in the post, and it got stuck in the port of Lud, I believe, over one Yom Tov. And there's a long story of Brisker Rav's tremendous chavivas hamitzvahs and nervin, how desperately he tried to procure this esrog, and the amount of times that he sent his son Rebbe Fol to the port to get it, but alas, to no avail, and ultimately this esrog was destroyed at the port of Lud, and the Brisker Rav was very saddened by the destruction of his Moroccan esrog. So the Brisker Rav prized the Moroccan esrog, held it was a very long-standing tradition, and he held that it didn't have the signs of Harkava. It was a esrog that didn't have Harkava, and he always liked to get one. Now, why was there an assumption that the Moroccan esrog didn't have Harkava? So this is something that was discussed in great detail by the Mukuravim of Rabbi Yashiv. Rabbi Yashiv 2 different times sent the Mishlachas to Morocco to sit by the trees and examine the trees and check the pardesim and how they grow and how they harvested. One of them was led by Rabbi Dunner, I believe, from London, and one of them was led by Rabbi Efrati himself a little bit later. And both of them, transcribed their experiences there and wrote down what they saw. And both of them are describing how the Moroccan Esrogim grow in a somewhat more mountainous and wild environment, and therefore they're less cultivated and they're less played around with than other Esrogim. They're more of a basic crop. Additionally, the climate over there lends itself to less parasites and less invasive species that could damage the trees, and therefore there isn't so much of a necessity to tamper with the trees to strengthen them, and therefore the Moroccan esrog has like a cheskes ein morkev. Additionally, in Satmar, Rabbi Yoelish, the Satmar Rebbe, whether it's because he didn't want to use Eretz Yisraelic esrogim, whether it's because he particularly favored, like the Brisker Rav, these Moroccan esrogim, Rabbi Yoelish would encourage his chassidim to buy, and amongst the Satmar, I think there's still a big amount of Moroccan esrogim. And additionally, the Satmar Rebbe sent mishlachas of chassidish rabbanim who sat by the trees and examined them and looked for all the simanei harkava and couldn't find them. So in the trees and in the pardesim and in the growers, a lot of research was done to establish this chazaka that it's not morkiv. So from mitzad, like the basis of like the production of these esrogim, it seems very clear that there's no harkava being done. Mitzad, the way the fruit looks, the way the actual fruit presents, there is where it's more problematic, and some places have had problems with it. Now, how do we resolve this issue that it doesn't have seeds? What's the resolution to this issue? So now, there's a very interesting machlokes between the Shvus Yaakov and the Chacham Tzvi about a similar but distinct question that really is the source to establish how the Moroccan esrog, although it's missing seeds, could still remain in good standing as an esrog. And I want to go into that a little bit. And the Minchas Yitzchak in Chelik Ches, in Tshuva Nun Ches, he shtels to this, I don't think he's the only one, but he shtels to this machlokes Shvus Yaakov and Chacham Tzvi, and we'll see how this is relevant. So there's a tshuva in the Shvus Yaakov and Chelik Aleph and Tshuva Lamed Vav, and it's a tshuva that we quoted in the past because over there is where he describes the whole story of Esrogim or Morkavim, and most of the tshuva is taka describing what constitutes an esrog, what doesn't constitute an esrog. But the shaila that's being discussed over there is a different shaila, and when he finally gets to it in the end of the tshuva, it's enlightening to our discussion. The shaila is as follows. I'll read you the shaila. It says, shaila al davar shechadashim mikarav bo. He says there's a new minig umatzu nigvin hadasim shenimtza beganim pei Prague. They started using the hadasim, the myrtle branches that grow in the gardens of Prague. Min hadasim lachem, it's a fresh green hadas. Im shleisha alim ibadechad, with 3 leaves growing out of every one of them. Lotzes behem yidei hadas lemitzvah min amuvchor, to be yotzei their mitzvahs hadasim in the proper way. Sheim adayim lachem gemurim, These are totally dry, wet and fresh hadassim because they grow locally. They don't crack with the fingernail. That's the tzad that they should be good, is that they're locally sourced, fresh hadassim that seem to have the simanim of a hadas. They're 3 in 1, they're beautiful, they're fresh, they're green. Or should we be chayshish about them? Maybe they're a morkav, they're a blended fruit, a blended myrtle branch with something else. And you need to be yotze with dafka, the hadassim that our forefathers always used. They come from far away, which is northern Italy. And they're samech to use pretty dried out hadassim that come from a long travel away, and use them because we know they're kosher. Or do we say that these hadassim that are fresh, that grow locally, that are green and they're beautiful, should we use these? Now, if you're asking me, it would seem like it should be a no-brainer. We found a locally sourced way to produce fresh and beautiful hadassim that have the characteristics of hadassim. They for sure outclass the crusty and almost dead myrtle that's being brought from long distances. It should be a no-brainer. Now, to which the Shvus Yaakov goes off on a whole long tangent about Esrogim, and then when he finally circles back to the hadassim, he raises an interesting point. He says, by Esrogim, you see that the Poskim, for whatever reason, be it as it may, each one has a different reason. He goes through it in some detail. The Haskamas HaPoskim is that we don't make a bracha on an Esrog that's morkav. And Gam the Meiser Rav, says that's the psak, and that's how it's adhered to. But then he circles back to Hadas. He says as follows. Let's go back to the Hadas Shaila. B'tchila chekarti v'nasati daiti lahavchin ben ma hefer sheyesh ben Hadasim asher nargu bo avisenim me'olam. I tried to figure out what's different between these hadassim and the hadassim that our forefathers always used. He says, Re'isi she'ein hefresh rak. There's one little difference over here. Zu, the hadassim ha'yeshanim, the old hadassim, ha'navim ketanim, the leaves are small, v'agulim and rounded. Daim legarine pilpul, and like pepper. We can't call it maril b'drashaysev. That's how the maril describes hadassim. Shekain darken shal hadassim. Mashenkim b'hadassim ha'chadashim, these new hadassim, ha'navim meshuchen ba'irich. The leaves are slightly elongated. The balls that grow there, like the seeds that grow there, are like bigger, rounder seeds. Mashenke b'yeshanim. V'adai says the yesh chashash hemi menachik. You have to be chayshish that these are a different min. Bushumi min amorkev. It comes from a blended min. V'chein amortche b'shem Rav Elazar mimitz. Af b'shapaslu yeveshim v'lula v'hadas arava. Fine. This continues. Now, what he ends up saying over here is that since these hadassim have these type of seeds that are growing, and the seeds look different than the seeds of the hadassim that was the long-standing tradition to use, the little balls that grow in the hadas, now we don't have them, they're taken off, but the little balls that grow in the hadas look different than the little balls, the little seeds that were growing in the other ones, in the ancient hadassim, in the old hadassim that were being brought from northern Italy. It says, based on that, I think that you have to be chayshish that these are a morkiv, and just like the poskim were machmer by Esrog not to use a morkiv, so too the poskim would be machmer, and says the Shvus Yaakov, one should not use these new hadassim, even though they're beautiful, they're fresh, they're locally sourced, you shouldn't use them. Now, this is the Shvus Yaakov's shita, and he reiterates this in Chelik Beis, in Tshuva Chav Ches, I believe. He reiterates this with a little bit more, and he reiterates this psak. Now, what's interesting is the Chacham Tzvi, in Shut Chacham Tzvi, in Simon Kuf Samach Aleph, the Chacham Tzvi disputes this, and he says that these hadassim are beautiful hadassim. These are the locally sourced hadassim. They're fresh, they're green, they're beautiful, and there's no reason not to use them. Adarab, he says the hadassim that are brought from long distances, other places, they seem to be, more suspect to being a hadas shaita. They're not as hadas looking how they should be, and therefore, even though b'diavad in a pinch, the tzibur was not to use them, but now that there are better hadassim on the market, of course we should use these. And when it comes to resolving the issue of the seeds, of these round seeds, the round balls that grow in the hadassim, and how they look a little bit different than the ancient ones, he has a very, very fascinating paragraph. He says as follows. This is in the middle of the tshuva, he writes. This that the Shvus Yaakov wrote, the hadassim that come from Italy, anveim ketanim v'agulim, their leaves are small and round, ve'ein bem shum garinim, they have no seeds, v'anemtsoyim etzleinu, and the hadassim that grow locally in Prague, anveim aruchim v'gdolim, their anveim, their leaves are longer and bigger, v'taychim nimtzu kama garinim, and they have some seeds inside there. Gedolim yesh lachsham shem merkavim. The Shvus Yaakov had said that because of these minor discrepancies in how the hadas looks, although to the untrained eye these would seem like milas, not chasronis, but the Shvus Yaakov said, since it looks different than the way we have Messiah, we have to be chayshish that it's morkiv. Says the Chacham Tzvi, the atu kol mine anve hagef and shavim, Do all grapes look the same? There are long ones, big ones, small ones, black ones, white ones. Every type of fig. They're not all the same. There's so many different varieties. Pay attention to that word, Esrogim. He says so too, Zeisim, Tapuchim, and Esrogim. There's so many different varieties and variants in fruit that are not core. They're not integral to saying it's not a te'ena, it's not a geffen, it's not an esrig, if it doesn't have some characteristic. And over here, in this one paragraph, the Chacham Tzvi seems to be disputing a lot of the precedent in what's keveya, morkev, and not morkev. He says there's so many variants that are in the citrus family, or in the apple family, or in the te'ena family, or the geffen family, that are acceptable, that don't change, that it's not called a morkev. This that you don't find any seeds in the Italian hadassim that you find in our hadassim that grow in Prague, they get harvested earlier in the season. The seed hasn't sprouted yet. That's why the leaves are smaller and rounder and the seed haven't sprouted yet. Ours are fresh, they're locally grown. You harvest them in the late summer, and that's why it looks differently. And therefore he says, these hadassim are not only kosher, they're better. It's a chumrah to use the locally sourced fresher hadassim, and one should use them. And I don't remember where I saw this, but I saw that the Chacham Tzvi's Einikel, the Nesivis, and many of the later dairies of the Chacham Tzvi's Einikel were makpid, dafka to use locally sourced hadassim, not these hadassim that the Shusaka was favoring from Italy. And I think that in this regard, the Chacham Tzvi won this argument, and the hadassim that became popular and prevalent were these beautiful hadassim that had all the characteristics of hadassim, even though they were locally grown and had these seeds that they weren't used to beforehand. Now, what does this have to do with our Moroccan Esrogim? So the two shtel is obvious. You see that the Chacham Tzvi is totally disputing the idea of seeds being such a keveya. The fact that there's a ball that grows, a little seed that grows in the hadassim or doesn't grow in the hadassim, is not an integral keveya. It's not the deal breaker that you would think it should be. And therefore, says the Minchas Yitzchak in his Tshuva, in Chelik Ches, in Siman Ches, the Minchas Yitzchak says, that is why the Briskerov and the Satmar Rebbe and Rabbi Yashiv, he's not quoting Rabbi Yashiv, but obviously Rabbi Yashiv and many other Gedolei HaPoskim favored these Moroccan Esrogim because of their tradition of non-harkava. The fruit itself presents differently. It doesn't seem to have seeds, and that seems to be like not fruit-like, and it seems to be a problem. Reference the Chacham Tzvi in his Tshuva that says that climates and soil and pollens and etc. influence a fruit one way or the other. Also, the fact that it's harvested earlier or later in the season, how long it stays in the tree, and etc. And therefore, the fact that it doesn't have visible seeds the way other fruits have is not a deal breaker. It doesn't mean that it's not an esrog. It doesn't mean that it doesn't have a good Messiah of an esrog, and you could use it and be samech on that Chacham Tzvi. Now, because of this, Taka many cries in many places. Rabbi Yashiv, I believe, I'm not sure this is trustworthy, but I believe I saw in a sefer that Rabbi Yashiv in his later years would even make his bracha l'mitzvah on a Moroccan esrog. That's how much he held it to be kosher. Obviously, the Hisachtos from under Satmar's auspices, and the Minchas Yitzchak and the Briskerov and others, also in the Archelaner, obviously from a long time back, also held that the Moroccan esrog was a good esrog. So these are some of the Tut Stadim, the tzad that says pro, because it grows remote and mountainous and has a long-standing tradition, and the various different Rabbanim went to check it, never found any signs of harkava in the way it was grown. And the tzad shekeneged that says no, it doesn't present, and that's Rav Nassan Adler and the Shevet HaLevi and the Chazon Ish and other poskim who are raising the point that it seems to lack some of the characteristics of traditional esrog, meaning it's not as bumpy, it doesn't have some of the same characteristics, and B, it's missing seeds, and although missing seeds is not, according to many early poskim, many early achronim, not an integral chelik of being kaveh and esrog, albeit maybe the Magen Avraham and the Eila Shabbos would hold that it is. The diak would be that they hold it is. But even though, according to, that isn't maybe dafka from the earliest sources, a siman of esrog, but it is al kapanim a siman of fruit. And the fact that it doesn't have it leads to some sort of, to be suspect that this was in some way tampered with. And because of that, Nassan Adler and other Yakisha early poskim and, later modern poskim wouldn't favor this esrog. Okay, v'aboicher yivcher. Good mayed.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.